Hello, today we're looking at the issue of terrorism and war, and specifically the issue of what the difference is exactly between terrorism and warfare. So you'll notice that this section is a little different. With some of the other topics, we've been looking at whether a particular action or practice is right or wrong in itself. Instead, what we're looking at today is the reasons behind something that we already, I hope, have some consensus on is wrong, and that's terrorism. So you're not going to see sort of a pro and con discussion about whether terrorism is good or bad. The readings and the presentation that you have for today are going to make the assumption that terrorism is in fact wrong and unethical, but really exploring a little more on what grounds we find it to be unethical, what the real difference is between terrorism and warfare. And to see if we have fully explored and articulated for ourselves good reasons for our condemnation of terror. And if we don't have good reasons for that, we probably need to develop some. So the first part of this lecture is going to be looking at some distinctions that we might want to make between terror and warfare using a concept of analyzing ethics in war called just war theory. So when we get to just war theory, that's going to kind of fill in the blanks in some of the material that Michael Walzer, the first author, was talking about. But first, I just want you to think for yourself what you think distinguishes an act of terror from an act of war. So it's pretty hard to tell from these two images whether these individuals are terrorists or soldiers fighting in war. They look like they're both in the same part of the world. They're both wielding the same type of weapon. So one thing we need to figure out is when we want to classify something as one versus the other. There are lots of ways we might do that. One might have to do with whether the individual is a member of a state's military or not, in which case we would have to think about whether you could be acting as a member of a military and also committing an act of terrorism. We might look at what their goals are or whether they're acting alone versus is endorsed by a group. So we can think about all these things, but that's just something that I want you guys to start thinking about as we go through the materials for today. And if you wanted to write a paper on this topic, that's definitely something you would want to consider. So in order to understand some of the morality behind how we in the West usually analyze warfare, we need to look at this idea called just war theory. So the first author, Michael Walzer, that you read for today, is using just war theory to analyze the difference between terror and war. And the term that he uses is the war convention. When he uses that phrase, what he's referring to is this conventional way of thinking about the ethics of war that is embodied here in the just war theory. So I thought I'd just kind of fill in what those basics are since Walzer doesn't tell you in the excerpt that you have, and that'll help you understand some of the ways in which both Walzer and McPherson, the second author, are asking us to think through this. So just war theory is a theory of ethical warfare put forth first by St. Augustine, who's that first picture there. He was a Christian philosopher and theologian in the 4th century of the Common Era, and then further articulated by Thomas Aquinas, who is the second guy here, and he was also a Christian philosopher and theologian who was around in the 13th century. So you can see by this that just war theory has been around for quite a long time in the West, and has really taken hold as the predominant way that we use to think about whether a military unit or military leader or the leader of a country has committed a war crime or has conducted themselves justly in the waging of war. So the assumption here is that it is possible to engage in warfare ethically. In other words, it is not going to be a pacifist idea that war is always bad and it can never be for the right reasons. So both of these philosophers are putting forth a theory that says you can wage an ethical war under certain conditions. So just war theory has three aspects to it, and we'll be looking at one of these in the most detail. And these are Latin phrases, that's why I have them in italics, and that's why my pronunciation is going to be a little strange. The first part of just war theory is called jus ad bellum, and these are criteria that you would have to meet before the war started to make sure that you had just reasons for going to war. The second, and the one that we'll be spending our most time on, is jus in bello, and that's just conduct during a war. So that's the main thing that we're going to be focusing on here today to analyze the difference between war and terrorism. And then thirdly, if we wanted to do a complete analysis of just war theory, we would also look at jus post bello, and it's just conduct after war, what you're supposed to do once a war is over. We're not going to be looking that much here today, but that would have to do with making and keeping treaties, returning prisoners of war to the other country and things like that. So for jus ad bellum, just reasons for going to war, I'm just giving you a short little snippet here. There's a lot more to it if you were to delve into just war theory yourself. I just want to lay out the basics that are going to be relevant for our comparison with terrorism. So when we have just reasons for going to war, again, these are considerations that a nation state would need to make before beginning warfare. So these are pre-war considerations. And the first is that it has to be for a just cause. What that means is that it can't be for personal gain, to acquire more territory, to get revenge on an enemy, or to show off your country's power. It should always be to help an ally or to rescue innocent people from harm. So World War II is a great example of a just versus unjust cause. Germany's goal in World War II would definitely not meet the criteria for just cause because it was to gain territory, conquer other countries, and to show off, right? Whereas if you wanted to make an argument that certain countries entered the war to fight Germany as a way to help their allies or to free the prisoners in the concentration camps, that would be a just cause under this theory. Secondly, proportionality. That has to do with basically the sacrifice, the bad things that happened during wartime being justified by the good result you expected. So there might be some instances when you have a just cause, but the price you would have to pay to achieve it would be so great that it's out of proportion. So that's another thing that you have to think about. You can't just stop at whether the cause is just. And then finally, the war has to be fought as a last resort. What we mean by that is you have to have tried other things first, like negotiation, compromise, diplomacy of a variety of sorts, sanctions, maybe economic sanctions against another country, before jumping straight to violence and warfare. Jus in bello, or just conduct in war, is another main aspect, and this is one of the central things that Walser and McPherson, the two authors for today, are going to want us to use and think about. The first aspect of jus in bello is discrimination. Now, usually we think of discrimination as a bad thing, but it's actually very good in warfare because it means that you're distinguishing or discriminating between combatants and non-combatants. So what we mean by that is combatants are the soldiers who are actively fighting in war, and it is okay if I'm a soldier during wartime to target another soldier who's actively trying to fight against me during that war. What wouldn't be okay for me to do is to target civilians, even if those are civilians in the enemy nation, right? So the idea here is that we are only allowed to target combatants in the just conduct of war. We are never allowed to target non-combatants. So hopefully you're thinking already that there are some examples of contemporary practice in modern warfare, basically from World War II all the way to the present, where we haven't done a very good job, at least in the West, of meeting this criterion of discrimination. We'll look at that in more detail in a minute. Secondly, we have the same rule of proportionality, which applies to how we ought to conduct ourselves during specific battles and military procedures. So we saw already that proportionality means that the goal must be proportional to the harm caused. This is something that you would use to evaluate any particular tactical move you want to make during wartime. And then finally, jus in bello determines how we ought to treat prisoners of war. Basically, the rule is as soon as an enemy soldier is captured, that person is no longer a direct threat to you because you're going to disarm that person and you're going to control their movements. So after that, you are no longer allowed to cause them any harm, and you must respect that person's dignity and rights. So think about these as we get to the question of what it is that's uniquely wrong with terrorism. In other words, we're all going to agree that terrorism is wrong. We need to figure out why that is. So the dominant view that Michael Walser talks about is the view that most people who are not actually terrorists would accept, which is that terrorism by definition is always wrong. It's very hard, especially for Americans after 9/11, to imagine a scenario in which you might even entertain that terrorism would be a good option. So why? That's the next question. We can't just stop with, well, everyone agrees, therefore it must be true, right? We already saw that all the way back to those fallacies of argumentation, that just because everybody thinks so isn't going to be enough evidence for us to say, therefore it must be right. We have to provide reasons for that. And when we have a high level of consensus, we often get lazy and we don't do that. So we have to investigate this. What makes it specifically, uniquely wrong, different than an act of war? Well, it targets ordinary citizens intentionally. So whereas acts of warfare may sometimes unintentionally harm civilians, acts of terrorism are usually targeted at citizens. So if we think of something like the Boston Marathon bombing from a few years ago, that was a great example of something that was designed to harm innocent bystanders. The goal of acts of terror is to create fear among the general population, and it's usually to achieve some political goal. So what we need to think about is whether these things that are usually put forth as things that make terrorism distinctively wrong apply only to terrorism, or whether they might actually apply to the way we wage modern warfare as well. So are these characteristics unique to terrorism? That's what we need to figure out. Well, according to Walser and McPherson, modern warfare can and does often violate the principles laid out in just war theory. The reason why that's a problem is that if we're going to say acts of terror are morally wrong because they violate these principles, then we're going to have to, in order to be rational and consistent, also level that same criticism against many of the ways, at least the American military, fights wars today. So if we want to look at some of this, the problem of discrimination is quite large in modern warfare. So what we have here in these images on the left is a British Air Force airplane dropping, this is a carpet bombing of the German city of Dresden in World War II. And you can see that just tons of bombs are being dropped out of the bottom of the plane over the city. There are people living in the city. This carpet bombing that occurred during World War II did not specifically try to target any particular buildings or areas of the city. So this is just something where an entire city is bombed, residential, commercial areas, didn't matter, they were just dropping bombs. The second image is an image from the sky of the atomic bomb that the military dropped over Nagasaki during World War II. Obviously, a lot of civilians are targeted there as well because of the widespread destruction. There's no way you can limit the damage of an atomic weapon. And then this third image is a drone aircraft that the American military is currently using in various places in the Middle East. And there have been a lot of complaints about U.S. military drones missing their target and harming civilians. So we know that modern warfare does in fact harm civilians. We know that. We have lots and lots of numbers and data that show the number of civilians versus the number of military targets and personnel that are harmed in modern warfare. And oftentimes we're talking about not even an attempt being made at discrimination. So with the carpet bombing that we see on the left and the use of atomic weapons that we see in the middle, there's not even an attempt at only targeting combatant targets. With the use of military drones, there is an attempt at discrimination. So the drones wouldn't apply to the second objection. But we do know, based on the numbers that are given to you in the readings, that this has resulted actually in a larger number of civilian deaths than combatant deaths. So modern warfare is actually more harmful to people who are not in the military than people who are. Now, of course, we're talking about people living in the war zone. So this is something that's actually hard for a lot of Americans to wrap their mind around because it's been a very, very long time since we've had a war on our own soil. So when we're talking about civilian deaths, we're clearly talking about civilian deaths in the countries where the combat is taking place. So here are just a few examples, and I'm going to go through these quickly. Landmines and IEDs are one great example of a war tactic that is not discriminatory, that will just as easily kill a combatant or a non-combatant. And these are things that a person walking in a field might trip accidentally, or driving down a street might trip accidentally, that have been set in the past to go off when they're triggered. So there's no way that a device like this would know who's triggering it. Therefore, it's just as likely to be triggered by a military target versus a civilian. And there's a big problem in many parts of Asia with landmines being left over from the wars that were fought there in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Chemical and biological weapons are another good example of a tactic that by definition cannot discriminate. These are agents that are released into the air, and anybody could breathe that air. We can't limit the way the air goes. And so in that instance, we have another warfare tactic that does not discriminate. Chemical and biological weapons were first used in World War I, but they're probably most famously used in Vietnam and more recently by the Syrian government in the conflict in Syria. And we know the modern warfare, because of these tactics that do not discriminate between combatants and non-combatants, do in fact cause a lot of fear among the population. So if you talk to or read about someone's experience in London during the time of the bombings, there are many times when the civilian population was awoken by air raid sirens in the middle of the night and told to shelter because here come some German planes dropping bombs on London. So modern warfare doesn't just cause harm to the combatants, the people in the military fighting that war, but it can cause a lot of harm and fear among the population as well. So because of that, we're going to be looking now at whether we think that the principles of just war theory are enough to condemn terrorism as especially wrong, or whether we ought to use those principles to also analyze the way that we fight war in the 21st century.